This is The Right Approach. I'm JW Judge, and with me is my co-host Barbara Hensky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft and business of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is Kyra Davis. She is an author, and in looking at your books, when I went to Amazon to check you out, after I'd reached out to you, I was trying to figure out the best way to describe your books, and it looked to me like murdery women's fiction. Is that
Okay, murdery women's fiction. You know what? I haven't heard those particular terms, but I am now putting that on the business card. Okay,
okay?
Kyra Davis, author of murdery women's fiction.
Okay. Is that a fair description of it?
It is a fair description. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I write these, I mean, in terms of the Sophie Katz book series, the murder mystery series, and to some degree the Pure Sin series, which is sort of a romantic suspense. These are women's stories. In the Sophie books, they're very light. It's there's a lot of humor. It's a lot about their friendships and their relationships, and there's a murder, right? So it's an amateur sleuth. I can't exactly call it a cozy because there's too much swearing and sex, but it's but that's not the center. It's certainly not the Sophie books. That's just their life, right? And that's what Sophie is. Pure Sin, which is again romantic suspense, is much darker and a lot racier. And then Just One Night series that's romance and straight up romance. So yeah.
Let's. Oh man, I drew a complete blank because I wanted to jump. Oh, humor. That's what I want to talk about since you mentioned it, because I like to include like bantery humor
Mhm.
in a lot of my dialogue. I mean, they're not comedies. Mine, they're fantasy. The first four novels were dark fantasy. My fifth one is a murder mystery, but I like to have that bantery, humorous stuff, and a lot of it is gallows humor that you have to have a particular mindset to appreciate.
Yeah.
But you never know if it's going to land. And I was texting with a friend of
Mhm.
mine who's reading my fifth book that's not out yet.
Mhm.
And he commented about one of the jokes that I'd made in the book and he thought it was funny. And I was like, oh man, that's such a relief to know that it landed. So when you're writing humor, um, what guides you, how do you approach it?
So I actually don't worry too much if it's going to land or not. Um, I get into the characters' heads, and then when you're writing, and I'm sure you both relate to this. At a certain point, you kind of get into this rhythm, right? And if
Mhm.
you're writing humor, that's a different rhythm than if you're writing like a tense darker book, right? Where it's and even if although there's humor in everything, I mean, there's moments of humor in every motion of a part of life, and I don't think a book that doesn't have humor can really be realistic. I don't care how dark it is. Someone at some point is going to laugh, smile, crack a joke. I mean, I say this as someone who's like spoken to Holocaust deniers. I mean, Holocaust survivors. Um,
Mm.
there is always a moment of humor somewhere along the line. So if you don't have that, you've taken your book outside of reality. It no longer feels real. But in the Sophie book, there's a lot of banter. It is a humorous book beginning to end. I mean, there's moments of gravity, like when she finds a body, but but as a generally speaking, there's a lot of humor in it. So you get into that rhythm, and if you're in the rhythm and you're in that banter, that back and forth, that beat, that kind of like that poppy beat, um, the banter starts becoming organic. And if you feel that rhythm, if you feel that beat, you're getting it right, And look, there's going to be not everybody likes pop music, right? Some people are going to be like, no, that's not my kind of humor. But for the people who read that book,
Mm.
that is going to hit. And so, so for me, just being inside these characters' minds, being inside the head, and being inside the rhythm, um, then the banter just comes and it's real. And if anything, you have to kind of go back and take out, right? Because you just can't have it. There is a plot, right? um, but but again, um, that part, if you allow yourself to go into it and don't worry too much about every joke hitting, just just get into the enjoyment of that conversation, and that's going to be it, and not everybody will laugh at every moment, every joke, but they'll enjoy it. And
Hmm.
that's the key with books. It's not a comedy club, right? Not every, they don't have to be rolling in the aisle, but they have to be enjoying it. They should be smiling. And if you have the rhythm, if you're in the head, if it's organic and you're just having fun with it, the reader will too.
Oh, I think that's great.
Yeah.
When you're talking about being in your characters' heads, I know
Mm.
every author kind of approaches this differently. And Barb and I have had conversations about our different approaches. For me, I'm very much figure it out as I go. Who these people are, I don't do a lot of work ahead of time. It sounds like you don't either. I was going to ask you, what does that look like for you? Before you start writing or as you're writing? Yeah, tell us a little bit about that part for you.
So, generally speaking, for my characters who are created from whole cloth, no, I have to discover them as I write them, and they introduce themselves to me. And as I kind of dig into them, as I get further in, sometimes I'll have to go back, say, oh, okay, this person is slightly different than I thought they were, and let's adjust for that. But they will introduce themselves to me. Now, right now, I'm shopping a historic fiction novel, and I have many of the secondary characters are based on real life people. That's a different thing. Okay, that's the first time I've done that, and that one I had to do enormous amount of research, and it's
Hmm.
always tricky because you don't want. I mean, legally, your lawyers, you can't slander the dead, but I still don't want to. Okay, I don't want to do anything that's going to like upset anybody, right? Or well, that's not quite right. I'm not. I don't want to do anything that is unfair to
Hmm.
anyone. And so, and I don't, well, if they have actually said or done something that deserves critique, I could play on that, but I don't want to invent a flaw that wasn't there. So that's a little bit different. And in that case, I think it really helps to have some fictional characters along with the um, the the people based on real life individuals, because you could give them the extra flaws that you don't want to to apply to those real life people. My husband is a filmmaker, and he does this all the time. Like he'll have historical figures or like these people like real life soldiers. Like he just did this not too long ago, did a movie called The Outpost, which was based on an actual battle in Afghanistan. Okay, my dog. Sorry. But um, but in that one, you know, he knew that there was frequently in these battalions, there's somebody in there, there's some degree, of racism, there's some degree um, of people who I want to use the word cowardice, that's not quite right, but don't rise to the challenge and such.
Mm.
So you create a fictional character for that, right? So you can have the reality of that in there, without hurting these individuals, who were actually there and died in battle, right? You don't want to do that. So you could take these fictional characters um, and give them the flaws you can't give to the real people based on real individuals. And again, I've totally gone off your point, but for that you do have to do research, and I did, and I read so many, oh my god, so many books. And I'm really lucky that even back in the day people were like coming close to self-publishing, like say like, okay, I'm just going to write my story, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to read your story. I'm going to play off of that. So for that I did a lot of research, but generally speaking, no, the characters introduce themselves to me as I write them.
So I'm so interested in this character arc stuff, because we all read craft blogs and books and all that. And there are some people that would have you spend months literally doing a 20-page detailed outline. I mean, I do keep some character notes because I can never remember who's a blonde, who's a brunette, and what color eyes they have, and their names of their dogs. I got to do that. I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's too hard because I write in series, so I got to be careful with that stuff. But about the only thing that I really do is I'll know what my main character's flaw is, that's provides the fuel for this plot arc. But that's
Right.
kind of it, and even that is only in the most general terms, and it's more intuitive for me.
Yes.
And I always beat myself up. I should be writing this down. I should be have all this big angsty thing. But then I think it's a waste of time just to write the book. How do you feel about, how much do you put down and capture?
Oh
Because you
gosh,
were serious.
close to nothing. I mean, honestly, it's like, yeah. I mean, look, I've seen people do that. There's one author who I really, and it just depends, right? Like Elizabeth George, who writes murder mysteries. She has that series. She has a series, a long series, and it's an exceptional series. And I've seen photographs of like these little cards that she has like spread out all over her floor, and she's sort of arranging. I mean, it's crazy the amount of research that she does. And look, it works for her. So God bless. Whatever works for you. For me, I mean, a couple of times I've tried that, and it's ridiculous because like I get 3 chapters in, I'm like, I'm not following this at all. So I don't even know why I did all that. And that first chapter or intro, for me, that sets the stage for everything in terms of who these characters are, what's going to happen. I mean, the first line in the first book in the Sophie Cass mystery series, she's a murder mystery writer, right? Or she writes kind of edgy books. And the first line is, the worst part about writing sex scenes is my mother reads my books. And right there, right, it's like, that's Sophie, right? You already, like, I've introduced her family. I've like, I've got introduced the humor. I know who she is, and I can work from there, And so, in the first intro in the Pure Sin series, I have my character, her mother has died in prison, and she's going to collect her things. And when she signs for it, she scrawls a name that is pretty illegible, but it's not her own. She's taking on this new identity in that moment, right? In that, and the darkness and the impersonal nature in which she gets the effects, from the guard, the way that she signs her name, that could be anything, could be Bologna, which she's basing off of, and she's in her hand is a book by Alexander Dumas. So we already have like the idea of revenge in her mind, right? Mm-hmm. And so right there, it's like she's got the book, she's writing a name that's not hers. She is angry but calculating, and I know who she is, And so when I had that first chapter, for me is much more valuable than an 80-page outline. It's this one, for me, that gives me what I need to go into the story, because there's nothing more important to me than the characters. Even, and even more than the plot. The characters and the relationships. And I'm not just talking about romance, I'm talking about friendships, I'm talking about the way relationships with family, all of that. And I don't know that you can outline that well. You that's not, it's not how we relate to one another in real life. We don't, I mean, we plan our careers, um, we may plan our schedule, but our relationships we can't plan. So turn that on. So I think that if that is the essence of your books, and it works for you, because again, everybody's different, um, just writing a little bit about that character and refining that first chapter should give you what you need to explore that without spending a year working out what you're going to write, only to discover that you're actually not going to write that. So yeah.
I have a follow-up question and then I'll let JW jump in. But do you very often have to find that you've started your book in the wrong place? I'm about ready to hate you because I bet you never do. I bet you never have to rewrite the beginning, do you? Go ahead and admit it if that's your case.
It's rare that I have to rewrite the beginning. It's yeah, I mean, but that doesn't mean there aren't sections that have to be rewritten, and occasionally I do. It's not like it never happens. And so yeah, it's like, but I have allowed that beginning to percolate in my mind for a while before I ever even get to the keyboards. So that part is clearer to me than anything else by the time I sit down to write. What comes next is I'm going to be anybody's guess, and that part gets rewritten a lot. So it's not like I don't do rewrites, but the beginning is usually that's usually my strongest, best chapter. And the thing is, again, I just mentioned that my husband is a filmmaker. In a movie, the most important thing is the last scene, okay? Because when you walk out of the movie, that's what hits you, right? That's what you're talking to your friends about. That's what it's like, oh, you got to go see this. In a book, it's the first few pages, because that's when you open that book on Amazon or a bookstore, you're going to read the first few pages, and that's going to make the decision of whether you buy it or you don't. It's like, and it would be nice to have a great ending, but I think we could all think of a lot of books that were like huge bestsellers where the ending is like, oh, I kind of wish it didn't really wrap up the way I wanted it to, right? But those first few pages are always so strong. And I think about some like literary fiction books, like The Goldfinch, right? The Goldfinch is kind of book that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate would have been like this massive bestseller. It's like, the pacing and sometimes the middle is a little bit quieter. It's very literary. In the first scene, a museum blows up. Okay, like, that's the first chapter. It's like, it's so intense. And it's like, you buy that book. So, and by the way, no criticism to The Goldfinch. I really love that book, but I'm just saying that it reached an audience that might not otherwise have reached if it wasn't for that first chapter. So,
Sure.
So yeah. So whether you get it right the first time or you have to go rewrite, that beginning is everything.
Yeah, that really registers with me. I know that the way you've been describing it, at least for the sixth book that I'm writing now, I'm about almost 20,000 words in, has been my experience in this book. I knew when I started in very broad strokes what it was about, and I knew how it was going to start. But after that, I didn't know how we were going to get from A to B, much less, like all the way through the alphabet. But once I learned who I have two protagonists, and once I learned who they were, I can now, and this has happened a couple times now, have kind of just an idea of what I want to happen in a chapter, and I just put them in the setting and start writing it and it still feels like magic to me.
Yeah.
How things just unfold first in my mind, and then I try and translate it onto the page before it runs away
Yeah.
and never to be seen again.
Mhm.
But yeah, what you were talking about needing for you, and
Mhm.
again, with the caveat that whatever works for you, go for it.
Right.
Um, once I put those people in that world and start writing
Mhm.
it, for me, I can sort it out from there. Not that there won't be hiccups or problems or whatever, but generally,
Right.
I need to be able to visualize that as I'm writing it to have any
Mhm.
context and any effectiveness.
Yes, exactly. And, when you can just when you can visually when you are really in, oh, I think there's a word for that. They call it the flow state, right? But when you're in the flow state, you're in writing, you're in that world. I mean, you're seeing it, you're there. And that's magical. I mean,
Yeah,
it's the human brain is magical. Okay. You've come up with this completely fictional setting and made it real for yourself. You're living it, and then you're going to take this world that you completely invented and bring strangers you've never met into it just by putting it all down on the page. That's amazing. and
yeah.
um
Yeah.
and yeah, and so it's really, I do feel um extraordinarily grateful and blessed to be able um to be able to do this for a living, to be able to live in these worlds that you can escape into and create, and breathe life into. And I keep going back to my first series, but the Sophie Katz mysteries. But those books were written in a really hard, or the first book at least, was written in a really hard time in my life.
Mm,
And um, oh my gosh, escaping into that world, into this world where I was laughing and having fun and hanging out with these women. I mean, that was such a cathartic, wonderful escape. I lived there with them,
mm,
um, and what's really interesting is that when that book came out, I got so many emails from readers saying, my husband was fighting in Afghanistan. I was feeling really, I was really stressed, and your book really helped me through. My baby was born 6 weeks premature, and it was like in the neo ICU and neonatal care. And I sat there just reading the book out loud next to, like next to the little incubator, and it helped me get through. It's like all these people who needed that same escape, um, because they were able to enter that world. And you know, for me, I wanted lightness, but sometimes I will have to admit that there's been times when I've been going through really difficult time, and you would think I would reach for the light book, and instead I reached for Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King. And two was this, I got to go into that world. And the great thing about the kind of books where you're dealing with crime or mysteries or bad guys is that there's a resolution. Like, things make sense in books. Things make sense. That's not always true in life. Okay. It's like, and not in the tragedies and the injustices of the world, but in the books, there's a reason for things. Whether you're dealing with supernatural or not, there's a reason. Okay. And there's some kind of answer to it. Even if it's not an answer that is uplifting, it's still an answer. Okay. There's a trajectory. And that's uh, really wonderful.
yeah.
It's really
Mhm.
wonderful at a time of so much uncertainty and so much confusion to have someone create a story that you can follow and make sense of and lose yourself in.
Mhm.
Well, all right. So you've mentioned uncertainty and writing for a living. And so I'm going to use that to segue to what caused me to reach out to you in the first place. So a couple weeks ago, I was on Threads and came across you as just someone that it, you know, pushed me to. And you wrote, and I'm going to read this because it's fairly short, and then we'll just jump into this part of the conversation. Is you wrote, "I've been relatively successful as an author." Relatively, which you put in quotes, because I've occasionally struck gold, but it has been frequently a struggle. I've made the New York Times list. There have been years when my royalties have been 150 to 350,000, and years when they've been 10 to 20,000. There have been times when my publishers have literally toasted me with champagne, and others when they've declined to give me a new contract. The lowest advance I've ever accepted ended up being for my highest grossing book. So I'm not sure where the best place to start is, other than you do this for a living. Even as you know, I think a lot of authors, particularly folks like me who are still trying to find our place in the market. Like, I'm writing books, but selling books is a lot different from writing books. You have this idea that once you've made it, like, you're there and you will continue to make it because you have made it. And even just that one post in Threads says, you know what? That's not always going to be the case. So what does that look like for you? And I guess start however you want.
Yeah, well, I thought that too. I thought, I mean, I remember when I got that first 3-book. I mean, because that was my first book, was my first attempt at a book, right? And again, I wrote it this hard time, and and like, we were talking about, when you first start out and you don't know what you were doing. I didn't know what I was doing. I went, this is going to date me, but I went to Borders, got how to write a novel book, right? And then got like Sue Grafton's Writing on Crime book, right? And I wrote this book, and I managed to get an agent. And after the first group of publishers rejected it, and the second group, there were 2 that wanted it, and there was a bidding war, and I got a fairly decent advance in a 3-book deal. I'm like, I have made it. I've made it, right? Exactly. I had been in this really bad place. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, I can make a living at this, And at the time, I was a single mom, relatively new single mom. I'm like, I can support my kid. I could stay home and write. I got this, right? This is great. And it felt like, this is my career. I mean, I'm not rich, but I'm doing it, right? I'm like, I got it. And then, and this is, you want to talk about the flux in publishing. I think for authors, there's probably nothing more dangerous than a publishing trend, because trends go out. And so when I started writing, I didn't know what chick lit was. Okay. But I was told, oh my gosh, this is perfect. We would be wanting to do a chick lit murder mystery. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what, wasn't familiar with that term, but I was willing to take it. Right. It's like, that's what you want to label. That's the category you want me to put me in. And it's going to sell my books. Great. That was, at the time, they were taking all these different authors in that genre at my imprint. And then I noticed fewer and fewer of those authors were getting new contracts. And then I was with a imprint called Red Dress Inc. Doesn't exist anymore. Was owned by Harlequin. Then they discontinued Red Dress Inc. Me and like 3 of the authors from Red Dress Inc. were moved over to Mira. And everybody else at Red Dress Inc. sort of disappeared, at least from this publishing house. I'm like, okay. And somehow that happened when I was like 4 books in. And I'd written 5 books with 4 in the series. And my naivete, I still sort of thought I was okay. I was safe. I got moved over. I was one of the last 3. And then the 5th book comes out. And if I was listening, if I was not so caught up in the mythology of once you've made it, you've made it, I would have heard when my editor said, we're going to change the cover. This is going to be good for you because the publishing house will see it as a rebranding. And I didn't quite get what he was saying. They came up with a dramatically different cover from the series in the fifth book. And then shortly before the fifth book came out, I was told, okay, they're not going to do another book. And I just didn't expect it, and it's like, and it's, again, I hadn't been rolling in riches, but I've been eking out a living and enough to support my son. With traditional publishers, you get paid every 6 months for your royalties, right? So that fifth month, that's when the credit cards come out. It's like, and it's like, okay, I'm just like, I just got to get to like the six, and then I'm okay, and then and all of a sudden it's like, that's it. And I don't. My agent at the time was not maybe quite as a great of an advocate as I would have really needed at that time. It's really easy to, when you're hot, and this is true regardless of whether you, again, film, novelist, whatever, it's not difficult to sell your work, and you can get an agent because everybody wants to get an easy sale. And when you're not hot, that's when your agents really have to start working. And the thing is that a lot of times and I'm not saying all of them, I'm not saying all of them, but for a lot of the bigger agents, they don't have to work quite as much. It's Stephen King apparently loves his agent, but I gotta tell him he doesn't need it. Okay, there's no, so he could call anyone up and just sell the book, right? So he was like, well, oh well, right? It's like, and he says it's gonna be really difficult from this point on, and I'm like, okay. And I pitched, and he did get me in touch with an editor at another publishing house who pitched me this like concept, and I'm like, okay, yeah, absolutely, I'll do that, right? And I wrote something up, and then they got back to me and said, actually, the marketing department says the concept isn't commercial enough.
Mm.
But it was your concept,
right? Yeah,
right. And so all of a sudden I'm not getting anywhere. And the months tick by. Then we get to the next 6 months, they're not reprinting my old books. It's still on Kindle, but my royalties are going down. Things are becoming a lot more stressful. And then I at some point, I said, okay, I'm going to self-publish the next Sophie book. I did have a built-in market for that. That's helpful. But this was a while ago, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I had, at this point, now we're getting past like a year. I had no money. And so I didn't have money for a graphic designer. I didn't have money for, the formatter or the copy editor, and it's like things were very tight. I didn't know what I was doing. I put this thing out, and it did okay, but it wasn't enough to really give me what I needed. There was, at some point, we're getting closer to the 2-year mark, or maybe it was the 2-year mark of when this happened. It was the summer. It was beginning of summer. I sent my son up to Northern California to spend the summer with my parents or my mother, my stepfather, and I took a job at Lexus. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to try and fail, apparently, to sell cars. I was working 6 days a week, right? And it was right at the beginning of that. Two things happened. One, like I said, I had self-published a Sophie book. Sophie has always sold exceptionally well as an audio book. And I don't think I quite fully understood what an intense fan base she had in the audio world, because Audible contacted me and said, hey, we've been getting all these emails from all these readers asking when the next Sophie book's going to be available in audio. And we're wondering if we pay for all the expenses, would you be willing to produce it? That was a yes, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, absolutely, definitely do that, right? So I actually knew my audiobook narrator got her on board. So now and then at the same time, I contacted my old editor over at Mira and asked him some administrative question about who I'm supposed to contact to change my address or royalties or something. And he said, "Oh, actually, I'm not there anymore. I'm at Simon Schuster. Would you be all interested in writing a erotic romance?" Right? And I'm like, "Okay." Right? And and they offered me nothing. I mean, they offered me nothing. And I was like, "Oh, I don't know if I can take nothing. I still had the sensibility to negotiate a little bit. So I got next to nothing. And I took it. And so now I'm getting up in the wee hours in the morning, doing a quick workout, writing till 8, starting my job at Lexus to try and sell cars. 6 o'clock in the evening, I'm done. I go write some more. In the lunch breaks, I'm working with my audiobook narrator. That's all happening, right? This is how I just sort of had to piece it together. The audiobook sold really well. Audible pays right away. That's great. I had a advance of $12,000 for the book for Simon Schuster. So now I'm able to reformat and do the new cover for the self-published. But it's still really, and I was able to leave Lexus because I couldn't do everything. But it was really tight, and the credit card balances was still going up and up and up. And then what eventually happened was Just One Night. That was the book I was hired to do for Simon Schuster in January. It came out and it did okay. Not spectacular. It did okay. It got a lower end of mid list, doing sales. But word of mouth on that book spread. People really, 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 really loved that book. And it was a little bit after, about a year or two after 50 Shades had hit, and more people were reading romance. So people who don't normally read romance were trying romance. And for whatever reason, they tried my book, or they tried my book because people told them about my book. Right. And, and the sales kept going up and up and up and up. And so I just wrote this on my Substack. And I vividly remember, like, around 6 weeks after the book had been out, I was at the mechanic where this very, very nice mechanic was administering end of life care to my car. was and I'm sitting in the waiting room, and my editor calls and says, "I just want to tell you, you just made the New York Times bestseller list." And I'm screaming, and
Yeah.
right, yeah, I like, oh my God, right? And everyone in the mail was like, "What the hell's wrong with this woman?" And then I tell the whole room, the receptionist asking for my autograph. Life is great. I get into the car that is good enough to get me home. Like, it takes a while, obviously, for, again, traditional publisher, it takes a while for the money to come. But now at least I know that eventually I'm going to be able to pay off the credit cards.
Yeah, something's coming.
Yeah, exactly. So again, it's like, you made it, right? Except I did make it, and I made an enormous amount of money for that, and that was that portion of my career really sustained me for a while. And also around that time I got remarried, and so fine. It was just, but things were good. But the love of, romance is always going to be huge, but I think my books were speaking to a somewhat non-traditional romance demographic, people who weren't normally in that world, right? And weren't necessarily going to the romance conventions, doing just tagged in. And and I own this one too, is that I also was not of that world. That was not, Sophie wasn't of that world. That wasn't where I came from. I didn't know that community in the beginning, and I didn't tap into it as much as I should have. And I didn't set the stage as well as I should have for if I wanted to continue in that genre. And I really want to put a big if there, because I'm not sure I'm a fully natural fit for romance. I wrote my first book when I was right at the end of my divorce, and for my first husband. And the last thing I wanted to do was write a romance. I wanted to write a book about people killing each other. And so this was definitely, it wasn't where I envisioned myself. I'm very proud of the books that came after Just One Night, but they did not sell as well. And to be fair, to myself, the other authors I know from who are that same imprint, also they saw their sales drop. But mine, it's like, but I didn't publicize as much as I should have. I didn't publicize correctly. Let's put it that way. They did fine. They just didn't do magical, right? The numbers didn't do magical. The reviews were great, but yeah. So then it was like, okay, so it's not like I can expect that I'm going to be making huge checks every day, right? And then there's another part of me too. I have heard that if you want to be a one-click author, which means, so someone comes, like they see your name, right? They click, they only know the title, they know it's about nothing. You have to deliver the same emotional experience every single time. When you buy a Grisham, you'll need to know what it's about. You know what you're getting. And it's the same thing in movies. Nobody ever asked, what's the Tarantino movie about? You're going to a Tarantino movie. It's like, that's what it is, right? I don't do that. I don't know that I emotionally have it in me to do that. I like to mix it up. I like to offer different experiences. I like to delve into different kinds of emotions and storylines and such. And like right now, like I said, I'm shopping historical fiction. It's very, very different than anything else I've done, but I love it. And if I want to do that, I have to accept that I am welcoming in volatility. I'm inviting it, even more so than any author, because if you're in this career, you're inviting it. But you can't go to publishers and say, hey, my book Sex, Murder, and Double Latte, which is really fun, and that book about that really sexy romance with the alpha Mr. Dade. Now I want to write a book about the newly affluent Black population of the 1940s in Los Angeles.
They don't know what to do with you.
Right, exactly. It's like, you don't have a platform for that, right? Yeah. So I have to accept the fact that if this goes forward, and I'm shopping it, people aren't going to just jump on it. That someone is going to have to take a risk. They're not going to give me the same advance that they gave me for my last romance. And okay, and I am very fortunate now because I am in a much more stable place, partly because of what those romances did for me, and partly because of my domestic situation. But there's been many times when I wasn't. And I think it's really, really important. Because again, when I got that 3-book deal, I'm done, right? When I got the New York Times list, I'm done. It's like, you're never done. You're never done. It is always a hustle. And so you have to remember 2 things. The good times for most of us do not last forever. And secondly, the bad times do not last forever. If you can remember those two things, you can savor those good times. Really, just take a moment. And again, on the Substack, I use the metaphor of a chocolate souffle. It took a long time to make that thing. It took a lot of skill. It's not going to last. So eat it slowly, enjoy every bite, just to consume it, right? But also, if you can remember that when you're in the bad times, this is not a forever thing. If you can remember that if you choose to continue to put one foot in front of the other, you will get to the other side of whatever hell you're through. It's like the best way to get through hell is to keep walking. So if you can keep that in mind and continue to set the stage for the good times, you're okay. Because the great thing about being an artist is that, unlike being an athlete, where your body at some point gives out on you, you decide when your career is over. Nobody else gets to decide that. You can be in the desert for a while. You may not be selling, but you decide when it's time for you to stop creating. And until you do that, you're not done. So you just keep pushing through. And if you continue to do that, then those bad, as long as you keep walking, you will get through whatever you're going through.
And that is such a perfect exclamation mark at the end of this conversation that has been so honest and introspective. And, we started with process, which I could have talked about for 2 hours, and came to this business realities and personal realities that affect the business. And I just, really appreciate your perspective on that and what you shared with us, because that was just really great.
It's going to be really encouraging, uplifting for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Good. I hope so. Everybody just stick with it.
Right.
Yeah. Keep walking. Okay.